Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we'll be exploring one of the most complex and controversial conflicts in recent history, a war that spanned over 2 decades, the Afghanistan War. The question we'll be answering today is simple yet profound: why did the US lose the Afghanistan War? This is a war that cost over $2 trillion, claimed thousands of lives, and ultimately ended in a way that few expected. To understand why the US lost, we need to dive into multiple layers of the conflict, from the external conditions on the ground to the internal failures, performance, safety issues, the costs of the war, and the ultimate conclusion that came when the US withdrew. The terrain of Afghanistan played a significant role in the difficulties faced by US forces. Afghanistan is a country defined by its rugged, mountainous landscape, where narrow valleys and high ridges offer perfect hideouts for insurgents. The geography provided the Taliban with significant advantages. Unlike the US military, which relied heavily on conventional warfare tactics, the Taliban used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to wage an insurgency, frequently launching ambushes, using improvised explosive devices, and retreating into hard-to-reach areas where US forces could not follow. The challenging environment prevented the US from achieving quick, decisive victories, and the constant threat of insurgent attacks wore down both the military and the public's resolve. Internally, the situation in Afghanistan was equally troublesome. The Afghan government, which the US supported and built from the ground up, was plagued by deep corruption and inefficiency. Despite the billions spent on aid and reconstruction, the Afghan political structure remained fragile, and the government was unable to gain the trust or loyalty of its own people. The Afghan National Army and police forces were trained and funded by the US, but they often lacked the necessary motivation, leadership, and discipline to fight effectively. This lack of internal cohesion was disastrous, especially as the Taliban was able to exploit these weaknesses and gain control over more territories. In the end, the collapse of the Afghan government after the US withdrawal demonstrated just how unsustainable the nation-building efforts were. The very government the US supported couldn't stand on its own, and that failure directly contributed to the Taliban's return to power. The performance of US forces in Afghanistan was mixed. On one hand, the US military, equipped with the best technology and a well-trained, professional force, dominated on the battlefield. They achieved several tactical victories, destroyed Taliban strongholds, and killed or captured many high-ranking insurgents, including Osama bin Laden in 2011. However, the tactical wins didn't translate into long-term strategic success. The mission, at its core, shifted over the years, from counter-terrorism operations to nation-building and counterinsurgency. The focus often changed depending on who was in power in Washington, and this lack of a consistent strategic vision undermined the effort. There was no clear understanding of what winning in Afghanistan meant, and as a result, the military's performance, despite being effective in specific instances, failed to bring about a lasting solution. The safety of US troops and civilians was another constant concern throughout the war. While the US military invested heavily in advanced technology, such as MRAP vehicles, armored Humvees, drones, and state-of-the-art air support, the nature of the conflict meant that safety couldn't be fully guaranteed. US soldiers faced a constant threat of attack from insurgents, and this made every operation a dangerous endeavor. The military's advanced technologies did provide protection and reduced fatalities in many cases, but the constant risk of insurgent attacks, IEDs, and even insider threats made the situation highly volatile. Over 2,400 US service members lost their lives, and tens of thousands were wounded. Afghan civilian casualties were also staggering, leading to international criticism of the war's conduct. The safety of civilians was compromised not only by the Taliban but also due to US airstrikes and military operations that sometimes hit the wrong targets. The war became a brutal cycle of violence that had no clear end. Despite these hardships, the US had a unique selling point in the early years of the war. The post-9/11 global environment allowed for widespread international support for the US invasion. The goal was clear: dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban from power. The initial justification was based on moral clarity and the pursuit of justice. The first few years of the war were characterized by a unified mission, with NATO allies joining the US in its efforts. The world rallied behind the US as it sought to dismantle a global terrorist network, and the early objectives seemed achievable. The US military was seen as capable, and the mission had widespread legitimacy. However, as the years dragged on, the mission became murkier. Nation building, which had not been part of the original plan, became a dominant focus. But without proper understanding of Afghan culture, governance, or society, the U.S. struggled to win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. The Afghan government remained disconnected from the average citizen, and the corrupt practices of its leaders alienated the public. Over time, the global support that the U.S. once enjoyed began to wane. The cost of the war was immense. By the time U.S. forces withdrew in 2021, the United States had spent over $2 trillion on the conflict, a staggering sum that did not bring the expected results. This figure includes the cost of military operations, reconstruction efforts, and foreign aid, but it does not account for the long-term expenses associated with caring for veterans, the psychological toll on service members, or the lasting economic impact of the war. The financial cost alone raises significant questions about the sustainability of the mission. Despite this colossal spending, the U.S. failed to achieve its long-term goals. The Taliban's resurgence, the collapse of the Afghan government, and the chaotic withdrawal in 2021 left many questioning whether the investment was worth it. The ultimate conclusion of the Afghanistan War was the rapid return of the Taliban to power in 2021, only days after the U.S. withdrew its forces. The equipment and resources left behind by the U.S. were quickly seized by the Taliban, and the group's leadership returned to control much of the country. This marked a humiliating end to a war that the U.S. had fought for nearly 20 years. The failure to leave behind a functioning, stable Afghan government, coupled with the internal fragility of the Afghan state, resulted in a collapse that could not be avoided. Despite the U.S. military's dominance in battle, the lack of a clear and achievable mission, the inability to secure long-term political stability, and the underestimation of local dynamics led to an inevitable defeat. The U.S. lost the war not because it was outgunned or outmanned, but because it failed to understand the nature of the conflict and the cultural and political realities on the ground. The Afghan War was never just about fighting a conventional enemy, it was about navigating an intricate web of tribalism, ideology, and governance, which the U.S. simply couldn't overcome. The war in Afghanistan serves as a stark reminder of the limits of military power and the importance of understanding the complexities of foreign nations when engaging in long-term conflict. As the dust settles, the lessons from this war remain critical for future military engagements and global policymaking. Thank you for watching, and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more in-depth military analysis.